Hi, I'm Steve Geinup, and today I want to talk to you about the Scenes feature in FrameVR, some free educational assets that I've made for the Scenes feature, as well as some basic ideas and principles that will help you be more innovative and productive when you're creating your own virtual presentations, stories, or lessons. Now, Scenes are very simple, they're very powerful, they're one of my favorite features, and yet they're the least utilized and probably the most confusing feature in FrameVR. And why is that? Well, let's explore. Right now, we are in a world, you, I, and my default student. And this world is also a scene. I'm going to click this arrow. I'm going to go from scene 3 to scene 2. And ta-da! Back and forth. Now the thing is, you and I and our student, we're not traveling to another world. We're not teleporting. We're not going to a different URL. It's coming to us. Information, content is being brought in and out of our world via something that FrameVR calls a scene. And you can imagine then that this ability is really, again, simple and powerful. Normally, when you've seen people do this, you go to another world, you have to teleport. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but consider how much of a hassle it is to get 25 students or your audience members to all click a teleportation link to find the menu. And then once they've done that, the world has to load. Once it's loaded, they're technically in a landing area and have to travel to wherever area that your content or information is. And that is convoluted. In fact, it's even challenging for me to say right now, right? Instead of doing that, using scenes, boop, in, out, it's coming to us. Now, teleportation makes sense when you've got a big standalone world, but let's say you're just doing something simple, like I want to bring in an object, like a space shuttle. We are now in a different scene, and all I did was have the model of the space shuttle loaded into this scene, and my students and I can now explore it. Go take a close-up look at the flag and step back. It's amazingly simple what we can do here. So, technical side, how am I doing this? I'm going to open up the FrameVR menu. I'm going to turn on edit mode, and down here then expand the scenes menu. Scenes pop up. If I want to add a scene, all I have to do is click the create a new scene, the green cross. New blank world. Just that simple. I'm going to delete it because, well, we don't need it. And if I want to talk about objects, notice now that I've clicked on the space shuttle and it's in scene 1, 6, and 8. If I want to add it to scene 2, check the little box, and now it's in scene 2. If I want to get rid of it from scene 2, I can go back in, uncheck it, and it's disappeared. So it's really simple to bring in information like we've done here. Let me turn off the edit mode. Scenes, simple stuff. And yet, how would you use them? How would you use this ability to change the world around you without actually teleporting or having to travel? This gets tricky. So for starters, I want you to think about all the things that you can bring in and out. I mean, you can do one image, you can do 1,000 images. You can do one 3D object, you can do a dozen objects. You can wrap a room around this space, or put a whole bunch of rooms and actually make a world around you. You can give these individual scenes all different types of purposes. For just to view, or discuss, or to explore, or interact in, or make in. So whatever your lesson or story demands, your scene can get that particular point across, and then go on to the next scene, whatever your story needs. Interesting stuff, though, because what most people do in VR right now, particularly multi-user spaces, doesn't really support anything that we've discussed so far. Most people do one of the following things. They'll do a 3D meetup, they'll do a 2D presentation, a tour of a space, or a simulation. I mean, this is all great stuff for multi-user worlds, but it gets to be problematic. I mean, a 3D meetup, chances are you're going to be in a bar or a classroom or an office space. Maybe you're sitting in a chair around a table. You don't necessarily get the full benefit of being able to, change out an entire scene like I'm doing if your only interest is to be in a room and just talk to people like you would be if they were in your reality, right? So 3D meetups don't necessarily exploit this. Now, 2D presentations, this gets interesting because like right now, this is like a PowerPoint presentation in 2D. Notice the same blue arrows down below? Yeah, this scenes feature, you can think of it as a 3D PowerPoint presentation where you're able to load objects and worlds and everything around your audience. So in some ways, the 2D presentation idea works as now in 3D in FrameVR, but there's still some trouble there because I want you to imagine the types of spaces that you've seen 2D presentations in, right? Chances are there is a raised stage and a raised audience area where you're sitting in rows of chairs or benches, and maybe there's even a little fence or railing in front of you. And the scene or the screen is off in the distance. How do you benefit? How do you actually benefit from having this ability to bring in entire worlds that when there's nothing here, I mean, we can explore. I mean, this doesn't really work in a theater space like the type you know of. We have to think a little bit differently. So yes, keep the 3D PowerPoint in mind, but no, you can't really do it in a 2D supporting theater space. Next up, tour of a space. See, a tour of a space like a gallery, that works. I mean, you go from point A to point B to point C. You just travel. And that travel can have value. I mean, travel does create a sense of ownership. It does create immersion and presence, the ability for me to personally move around a scene. And yet, a long tour adds up. And long distances for very small amounts of information don't necessarily make sense. I mean, it's like the whole teleportation thing before. So, I mean, we can do travel, and you should have travel, some travel in your scenes. But if it's not necessary, you can think about this not only as PowerPoint, but as a 3D tour. Instead of traveling from place to place, the tour comes to you. So again, reimagining and rethinking what people have already done will help you do better work when you're using scenes. As for simulations, I mean, this is really interesting because simulations and bigger and better and more realistic ones are kind of the pinnacle for most people. This is what gets privileged and is aspired to, the big simulation. But they're kind of a pain in the butt to make. And again, like everything else, reality gets in your way. So much so that this little feature right here doesn't really fit with the idea of doing a perfect simulation because reality doesn't exist, or a reality doesn't exist that has this feature unless it's, virtual. And in fact, as I go back and forth like this, it probably feels a lot like novelty. This is just a novelty, maybe powerful, maybe not. You need to get past that because this really is powerful stuff. And the reality that we need to copy isn't necessarily physical reality, but maybe we think about this as a cinematic reality, a filmic reality. So Earlier I mentioned you can think of scenes as PowerPoint. You can think of it as a tour that comes to you. You can also think of scenes as sort of a filmic way of dealing with virtual reality. In fact, let's do this. Let's go to the next scene. Next scene. Next scene. What did you see? You saw a transition. In fact, it's kind of like fading in and out, right? Because let's face it, this feels very abrupt. But this, not so much. There's a language of cinema that applies here, the editing of reality, jump cuts, close-ups, flashbacks. I can even go in, look down, and, hey, crane shot. There's a lot to say about cinema. Early cinema, the first films, the goal was to be as realistic as possible. They set up a camera and they captured reality. That was it. The goal was to, we need color, we need sound, we need better frame rate, we need film that doesn't break, we need film that doesn't catch on fire. That's the hallmarks of the very earliest days of cinema. A very famous filmmaker and famous racist person, D.W. Griffith, he was actually criticized for cutting up his movies. This critic came to him one day and said, "How are people going to understand your movies when they're cut up like that?" And Griffith replied, "Well, doesn't Charles Dickens do this?" The critic fired back, "Well, that's novel writing, that's storytelling, that's different." Griffith had a comeback. Griffith said, "These are picture stories, not so different." And that fundamental idea that you were telling stories in movies, let them break from reality. This is the same sort of process and principles that we are just beginning to understand here in the virtual. How do we edit reality to create belief and behavior in our users? We use it to tell stories, but we're also setting people up to do interactivity, right? And my little scene here, I cut away the floor, and notice this edge. What do you do when you come to the edge of something? Chances are you stop. I'm using this edge as a way to stop the audience so that they can actually be positioned to be and see exactly what I want them to see. So that when I bring in other objects, like this rocket engine, they're in a great place to see it, explore around, and then maybe go back. Where I can bring in the next object. 2D. Boom, boom, boom. And this is largely how I use Frame's scenes feature in my own work. I build little installations, and sometimes I just show them. Sometimes I ask my students to explore. When I was working in older technologies like the reaction grid Jibe, Exit Reality, I could build interactive things. I could do some really neat stuff. Here, we're still doing neat stuff, a little different though. So, yeah. Boom, boom. Easy. This is how I do my virtual presentations. I don't necessarily need the grass. I don't need the background. You can do amazing things. That's not to say there aren't challenges. And when you start breaking from reality and you start doing going beyond what the developers themselves intended, you do run into trouble. I love these little windows. I love these little video screens, but they exist in every single scene. You can't put a video panel in and then take it out in the next scene automatically. So that's why this is here. In fact, this panel was here too the entire time. But earlier, this was hiding behind a green screen, right? So there are some tricks that we have to play to get things to work. And me, I love cutting away the ground plane. I mean, not just because I get a kick out of stopping people at the edge, but I like this big image. And notice that, it's huge. And I can wrap, my students, my normal class size, around this space. And, if I had a bigger class, I could just, scale up the classroom. It's not that difficult. But there are some challenges here too. Like, I'm going to turn on the edit mode, and you'll notice that when I go down, the image disappears. You see, FrameVR put in place a transparent ground plane, a gray 50% transparent ground plane, that if you have a 2D image, it cuts it off. It won't render if it goes through. And why is that? Why is this disappearing? Well, look, this is WebGL. It runs in a web browser. It's not necessarily the most powerful game engine. So to optimize things, they cut it rather than render it, because rendering things in transparency takes up a lot of your processor power. Technically, I would love to have this ground plane gone, replaced with a wireframe grid or just an outer little fence. But for now, this is one of the little challenges we have to deal with, that we don't necessarily get as much benefit out of the FrameVR as I would like. And it's kind of a sad thing because, in FrameVR, they do give us this feature that lets us zoom in and out of images, right? I really, this kind of bugs me a little bit. I would much rather not have a 2D image glued to my forehead. I would much rather have this be a full-size image because, again, I cut away my ground plane and I've built a space to hold big images rather than try to force fit my needs into a realistic looking space. And I think that's kind of fundamental for you to think about just as your own designer and developer. I mean, if you're critical of my class space, this deck that I largely use, that's fine. I mean, you have every right to be critical. But if your only other option is to copy reality, if your only other notion is to build a space that looks like a physical world theater or a physical world classroom, you might not be going far enough. You might not be thinking deeply enough. And for that, you need to begin to play and try doing different things. And playing is a good way of doing things, all right? So the last sort of, closing way of doing things here is just playing around. So here is a big green field we can play in. Yeah, you get another scene. And in it, I have dropped my little quiz boards that we can go stand on. So we've got the answers in front of us. The first online multi-user platform was created by who? Lanier in 1990, George Lucas 1985, Bill Gates in 1996, or Lucky Palmer in 2015. I am working on a timer, so maybe that'll come out in a month or so, because you can actually start and stop animation in FrameVR, but we'll see. For now, though, I'm just going to show you the answer, which is C. And so I've kind of kept it highlighted. And in the frame that follows, I put another model in that just hides what the wrong answers are. So again, next scene, next set of questions, next PowerPoint slide. Who said handcuffs displayed would be confining and a bullet displayed would be fatal? Jared Lanier, 1991, William Gibson, 1985, Ivan Sutherland, 1967, or, again, Lucky Palmer. Well, technically, I think that all of these people, with the exception of Gibson, even Gibson, could have said this. But the correct answer is B. Whoops. So, now we're in the wrong answer. Now, there's no collision in FrameVR, so if there was collision, I could actually stop people who had the wrong answer from going someplace. Again, little bits of challenges that we've got. Having said that, the right answer is here. Whoever actually stood on the right answer gets to go forward and on to the next question. Oh, by the way, Ivan Sutherland, yeah, this was in the ultimate display. Last question. When was the Hip, Hype, and Hope 3 Faces of Virtual Reality SIGGRAPH panel? This was a seminal event. This was like the first big coming out party for VR. And this was 1991. The correct answer is A. Whoops, I keep going the wrong way. The correct answer is A. The funny thing about it is that if you read the transcripts in 1991, 90% of what they said, or 90 actually, probably like 99%, with the exception of one guy, everything they said was still the solutions and the problems. Nothing's changed. It's like we're standing still. In spite of all this development, in spite of the advances in the hardware, our understanding of VR really hasn't progressed. And that one guy that actually did make, I think, to me as a designer, a lot of sense, well, his name was Timothy Leary, a philosopher and LSD enthusiast. And he compared VR and went into some ideas from Marshall McLuhan and the medium is the message and such. So, interesting stuff. Do check it out. And if you actually do this live quiz with me sometime, because we can run all of this as a live demo with anybody who wants. I mean, happy to run this again, and you can be a part of this presentation instead of just having my little anonymous student who accidentally got the answer C right. I mean, we can do this. In fact, you can do whatever you want. This is a time to explore. This is a time to do great things, to break new ground. If you need help, contact me. You can use the URLs and the links that are in my FrameVR space, or the email that is listed in this YouTube video at the very bottom. All right? So you guys have a good night, and best wishes.